All right, so this is the last of the Industrial Revolution, and it's a little bit longer. So our content statement still is: industrialization had social, political, and economic effects on Western Europe and the world. And our learning targets are to describe the growth of population, rural to urban migration, and the growth of cities associated with the Industrial Revolution. To identify the social and economic impacts of industrialization, including its effects on women and children and the rise of organized labor unions, and then describe the environmental impacts of industrialization and urbanization. All right, so first and foremost, the Industrial Revolution was an economic phenomenon, and it also had political consequences like the rise of big government, and then it had social consequences like the change in people's day-to-day lives. So the effects of the Industrial Revolution. So there's positive and there's negative. So more and better education, environmental pollution, a higher standard of living, urbanization, better forms of transportation, population increase, the growth of middle class, and poor working conditions for the lower classes. So the industrial labor and the family system. So the cottage or the domestic industry, it was that those were family businesses, and family members, they worked together. They worked at their own speed. They could take breaks. They ate meals together. They talked and they sang while they worked, and they were equal to the merchant that they worked with. So under the cottage and the domestic system, the family system was assuming that like you had a good working family was positive. Now industrial labor under the factory system, the goal was about productivity. Uh, the workers had to follow orders. They worked 6 days a week. They worked 12 hours a day. This is even kids that are 9 years old. You were fined if you were late. You could not talk to each other. You had to focus on the work that you were doing all of the time. The workers and the bosses were not equal, and workers were what are considered to be a lower class. So in the cottage industry, women and children, they performed vital jobs, and because of that, their work was valued. In the factory system, women performed unskilled labor in factories and in the mines, and so they were paid less. So in the factory system, there were fewer jobs available for women, and they were often out of work, and women could find other work. They could be laundresses, servants, teachers. By 1900, factory work and mine work was considered to be men's work, and women were expected to not work in those positions or industries. Children in factories, children worked in textile factories and in coal mines. They were unskilled labor. They worked jobs that required small hands. They were paid a lower wage. Parents sent them to work because all wages were low and the families needed everybody to work. So the following are a few facts about child labor. So the Industrial Revolution, it saw the first widespread use of exploitative child labor. The word exploitative is very important. It's going to be used by the Marxists. In 1835, there were more than 56,000 children under the age of 13 working in the textile factories in Great Britain. And in 1900, 1 in 6 children were employed full-time in the United States, more than 1,750,000 children. Child labor within textile factories, it symbolized the evils of the Industrial Revolution. There will be laws protecting working children became a high priority for reformers, but this isn't until the 1900s. By the late 1800s, education was gaining in importance, and there were laws passed to prohibit children in factories. This is in England. So how did the factory system change lives? Well, industrial workers were now part of a lower social group, the working class. Work was now done in factories instead of in the home. Workers were given strict time schedules to speed production rather than working at their own pace at home. Workers were given specific individual roles and tasks. Women and children were paid lower wages than men, but their income was often necessary for the family to survive. This is important, you guys, because prior to the factory system, men and women in the homes, they were equal, at least in terms of what they offered. This has changed. They're paid less. This means that in the eyes of many, they will be worth less. Population increase. So this is England. This is London specifically. So European population was about 140 million people in 1750, and by 1850, it's risen to 266 million. Death rates begin to decline. There's no war in Europe for the first time in a long time. Famine and poverty, these were two factors in global migration and urbanization. And what I mean by that is there's going to be this potato famine that strikes not only in Ireland, but also it will expand out to the rest of Europe. And this is going to force many people to have to find a new place to live. So many will flee to the United States. And then the enclosure movement, which remember, this is where landowners begin to parcel off, put up fences, and then force peasant farmers off the land. And then just poverty alone led millions of people in Europe to have to seek a better life, and that better life was in the steerage of a ship going across the Atlantic to the United States. So enclosure and industrialization also led to urbanization. So urbanization. So before the Industrial Revolution, most people lived in the country, like 95% of the people did. Manufacturing took place in the country, and town was for commerce and government. So you'd go to town to do trading, maybe to go to church, and then if you had some sort of legal issue. Now, after industrialization, towns become the main location of manufacturing. Factories will attract workers who are displaced by changes in agriculture, and migrants will settle near factories, expanding populations of towns and cities. So industrialization also encouraged migration from one country to another. So the United States was a major destination for immigrants. So the pull factors were to the United States were the jobs, and also the United States still had a lot of farming, specifically in the Midwestern, and then the central parts of the United States. And there were push factors. So in China, there was civil war. There was also famine. Japan, there was famine, and then many countries in Europe also had famine, and you can see this in the numbers. So 1.5 million people left Ireland. Okay, compare that with 216,000 French. There's a reason for that, and that's because Ireland was hit hard by the potato famine. This explosion in number of factories and the flood of migrants to factory towns meant that urbanization was very rapid. There are no like building codes, so houses are just put up. There's not a lot of safety. There's not any thought to safety. And this urbanization it's the process of turning a rural area or a village into a town or a city. Environmental pollution. So in newly urbanized areas, there's no government regulation of industry. Remember, they're laissez-faire. So smoke would belch from the chimneys, and this smoke it's burned coal. There's industrial waste that's just poured into the rivers, like when you are taking tin, you're melting. You want to keep the tin, but anything else that's a waste, they just dump it into the rivers, which poisons the rivers, like with mercury and things like that. There's no government public health programs, so streets are filthy. The cities are overcrowded. There's widespread disease. There's urban deaths actually soar. You had a much better chance of living a longer life if you could live in the country than if you lived in cities. And there was outbreaks of fires, there was crime, but the biggest reason would be disease, cholera, things like that. So the poor working conditions for the lower classes. So this is a interesting alleyway, which would have been typical of the time. So this banner is calling for 8 hours of labor, 8 hours of recreation, 8 hours of rest. And this is what unions were striving to achieve, was a balanced work day. So labor unions, saw they saw working conditions, and they needed to reform them, to change them. So most people were working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. They were working in dark, damp, dirty, loud factories. There were few, if any, safety precautions. So that meant that these places were extremely dangerous. People could lose arms. They could lose, you know, they could lose their lives, and there was really no consequence to it. Um, Factory owners, they kept the pay as low as possible to increase their profits. So people were seen as a resource. So labor unions are organized organizations that form by workers to represent them in negotiations with their employers concerning employment issues. Pay is part of it, but working conditions is also equally important. So for early labor unions, these issues included wages, hours, and working conditions. So labor unions, one of the things that they would use is a strike. This is an agreement among workers to stop working in order to force an employer to improve wages, hours, etc. And strikes often turned violent as workers would go and fight with the police, who were hired by the factory owners to break up the strikes. So what would happen is you would go to work, you would be doing whatever it is that you're doing, and then someone would come in and they would blow a whistle, and that whistle was a signal to stop working, put down your tools, and leave. And then there would be an agreed upon time, say it's noon, and all throughout the city, whistles would blow and the workers would all stream out. And by 1900, most workers had shorter hours and safer working conditions because of the use of the strike. So through the first century of industrial revolution, industries grew with no government intervention. It's laissez-faire, leave it alone capitalism. So governments left industry alone. A key element of liberalism is the right to private property, which was advocated by men like Adam Smith, and he eloquently places this down in his Wealth of Nations. So why would Adam Smith support a laissez economic system? Well, he believed that it's the role of the government to just give protection to people's lives, to their liberty, meaning their freedoms, and then their property. And that society is best served when producers seek profit, and they create food and other goods rather, and they sell them at market. So the idea here is like people are in the society who are producing things are going to want to make money, which means they're going to want to produce good things, and the government should not interfere in this process. It's a little bit naive, and if you Adam Smith and others that are not Marxist economists, is what I'm talking about, they'll never use the word exploitation. So they think that you and I, if we have a job and we don't like that job, you have the freedom to find another job, which is equally naive because if you have bills, you have to pay those bills. And so that means that you're forced between no job or a job which is exploiting you. So the rise of big business and industry, it led to the government to have to rethink its policy because in the United States, for example, some of these industrialists were so wealthy that they pretty much owned Congress. Like J.P. Morgan, a famous financier he bought out Carnegie Steel. He actually bails out the United States when it goes bankrupt with his own money. So these people are probably a risk to democracy. So big businesses, they made profit and they did this at the expense of workers. So what rights do the workers have that are not being protected? So that has to be determined. The workers have their own view. The owners have a different view. So the government has to step in, and they do, and they restore fairness in the marketplace, and they provide safety regulations in factories and cities. So the question here is, list one way that you think government should have regulated big business in the 1800s, and then explain why you think that they should have regulated businesses in that era. You might have to think back to ninth grade a little bit on this, or at least U.S. history, depending on what year you had it. But what could the government have done that it wasn't doing, and then why didn't the government do anything? So a worldwide trend begins. So until 1900, industrialization was limited to Western nations, so the United States, England, Germany, France, and then it will expand out to Russia and then Japan. And then industrialization begins to spread It wanted because people wanted improvements in the standard of living. Democracy begins to spread, and then people want capitalism. They want industry. So countries are going to use their wealth to do things like strengthen their military, and then they would use their military strength to establish colonies and expand empires. This is done in the United States. This is done in Russia. This is done by Germany. This is definitely done by Japan. So there's a process. You industrialize. You use that industrialization to militarize. Then you use that militarization to expand or colonize. So these are some of the philosophers during the time of the transformation from agrarian to industrialization. So you've got Adam Smith, Charles Fourier, and then Karl Marx. You can listen to John Lennon's Imagine song. I can't play it because if I do, I'll get a copyright infringement. So this is Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx. These are two socialists. They're not the original socialists, but their work has had the greatest impact on the world. So radical ideology of Marx, it's communism. So it's Marx and Engels, but so they look at the economic system, and property is publicly owned under communism instead of privately owned. So they're against Smith. Sorry. Everybody works, and they're paid according to their ability and their need. Um, they write all this down in the Communist Manifesto. It's written by Marx and Engels. It's pretty small. I mean, you could easily read it in an hour. And what it does is it outlines what they viewed as being the problem with capitalism and the promises of communism. The thing of it is it doesn't actually spell out a whole lot about like what's that transformation going to look like. What is a communist utopia going to look like? It's more like it's just ideas. So in it, they complain about the unequal wealth distribution, meaning the working class people, who are the proletariat, to overthrow the capitalists, the factory owners, the bourgeoisie. They want to redistribute the wealth of the people that have wealth to the people that don't have wealth, and they want governments to control the factors of production, and they want that to happen for the people. So this last one, well, these last two actually, this would be considered socialism, not capitalism necessarily. Many countries do this, specifically in Europe. So Karl Marx said, the proletariat have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of the countries unite. So communism it's a reaction to industrialization and capitalism itself. So capitalism is the economic system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private people, and it's done for profit. And property is, again, privately owned. Wealth is distributed unequally, so you have some people who are extremely rich, and you have many people who are extremely poor. And the prices are controlled by the laws of supply and demand. So if the price is too high, you don't buy it. Okay. So Smith, in his Wealth of Nations, he wrote, it is not from the benevolence, meaning the goodwill of the people, of the butcher or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own interest. Because if you go to a butcher, they don't just cut the meat and then give it to you. You have to give them something in exchange. And what they're looking for in that exchange is money. And then they're going to use that money for whatever purposes that they want. So capitalism versus communism is going to be a long-standing issue from essentially the middle of the 19th century until, I would say, the year 2000. I mean, you could even say today. So, but that's for another time. So that's it. So that's industrialization.